Hello and welcome to day 94 of the Not Alone Today chronological Bible reading plan. Today we'll be reading 1 Chronicles chapter 9 from verse 35 to 44, and then we'll be reading the same book from chapter 10 to chapter 11. We'll be using the Good News translation.
1 Chronicles 9 from verse 35 to 44. Jael founded the city of Gibeon and settled there. His wife was named Maacah. His oldest son was Abdon, and his other sons were Zor, Kish, Baal, Ner, Nadab, Gedor, Ahio, Zechariah, and Mikloth, the father of Shimeah. Their descendants lived in Jerusalem near other families of their clan.
Ner was the father of Kish, and Kish was the father of Saul. Saul had 4 sons, Jonathan, Malchishua, Abinadab, and Eshbal. Jonathan was the father of Meribal, who was the father of Micah. Micah had 4 sons, Pithon, Melech, Tariah, and Ahaz. Ahaz was the father of Jarah, who was the father of 3 sons, Alemeth, Azimaveth, and Zimri. Zimri was the father of Moza. Moza was the father of Binia, Binia of Raphiah, Raphiah of Eleazar, and Eleazar of Azel.
Azel had 6 sons, Azrikam, Bocheru, Ishmael, Sheriah, Obadiah, and Hanan.
1 Chronicles chapter 10. The Philistines fought a battle against the Israelites on Mount Gilboa. Many Israelites were killed there, and the rest of them, including King Saul and his sons, fled. But the Philistines caught up with them and killed 3 of Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting was heavy around Saul, and he was hit by enemy arrows and badly wounded. He said to the young man carrying his weapons, "Draw your sword and kill me, to keep these godless Philistines from gloating over me." But the young man was too terrified to do it. So Saul took his own sword and threw himself on it. The young man saw that Saul was dead, so he too threw himself on his sword and died. So Saul and his 3 sons all died together, and none of his descendants ever ruled. When the Israelites who lived in Jezreel Valley heard that the army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and ran off. Then the Philistines came and occupied them.
The day after the battle, the Philistines went to plunder the corpses, and they found the bodies of Saul and his sons lying on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers with them throughout Philistia to tell the good news to their idols and to their people. They put his weapons in one of their temples and hung his head in the temple of their god Dagon. When the people of Jabesh in Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, the bravest men went and got the bodies of Saul and his sons and took them to Jabesh. They buried them there under an oak and fasted for 7 days.
Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord. He disobeyed the Lord's commands. He tried to find guidance by consulting the spirits of the dead instead of consulting the Lord. So the Lord killed him and gave control of the kingdom to David, son of Jesse.
Chapter 11. All the people of Israel went to David at Hebron and said to him, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, even when Saul was still our king, you led the people of Israel in battle. And the Lord your God promised you that you would lead his people and be their ruler." So all the leaders of Israel came to King David at Hebron. He made a sacred alliance with them. They anointed him, and he became king of Israel, just as the Lord had promised through Samuel.
King David and all the Israelites went and attacked the city of Jerusalem. It was then known as Jebus, and the Jebusites, the original inhabitants of the land, were still living there. The Jebusites told David they would never get inside the city, but David captured their fortress of Zion, and it became known as David's city. David said, "The first man to kill a Jebusite will be commander of the army." Joab, whose mother was Zeruiah, led the attack and became commander. Because David went to live in the fortress, it came to be called David's city. He rebuilt the city, starting at the place where land was filled in on the east side of the hill, and Joab restored the rest of the city. David grew stronger and stronger because the Lord Almighty was with him.
This is the list of David's famous soldiers. Together with the rest of the people of Israel, they helped him become king, as the Lord had promised, and they kept his kingdom strong.
First was Jashobim of the clan of Hakmon, the leader of the three. He fought with a spear against 300 men and killed them all in one battle. Next among the famous three was Eleazar, son of Dodo, of the clan of Haor. He fought on David's side against the Philistines at the battle of Pas Dammim. He was in a barley field when the Israelites started to run away. So he and his men took a stand in the middle of the field and fought the Philistines. The Lord gave him a great victory.
One day, 3 of the 30 leading soldiers went to a rock where David was staying near Adullam cave, while a band of Philistines was camping in Rephaim Valley. At that time, David was on a fortified hill, and a group of Philistines had occupied Bethlehem. David got homesick and said, "How I wish someone would bring me a drink of water from the well by the gates in Bethlehem." The 3 famous soldiers forced their way through the Philistine camp, drew some water from the well, and brought it back to David, but he would not drink it. Instead, he poured it out as an offering to the Lord and said, "I could never drink this. It would be like drinking the blood of these men who risked their lives." So he refused to drink it. These were the brave deeds of the 3 famous soldiers.
Joab's brother Abishai was the leader of the famous 30. He fought with a spear against 300 men and killed them, and became famous among the 30. He was the most famous of the 30 and became their leader, but he was not as famous as the 3.
Benaiah, son of Jehoiada from Kabzeel, was a famous soldier. He did many brave deeds, including killing 2 great Moabite warriors. He once went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. He also killed an Egyptian, a huge man 7.5 feet tall, who was armed with a gigantic spear. Benaiah attacked him with a club, snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with it. Those were the brave deeds of Benaiah, who was one of the 30. He was outstanding among the 30, but not as famous as the 3. David put him in charge of his bodyguard.
These are the other outstanding soldiers: Asahel, Joab's brother; Elhanan, son of Dodo from Bethlehem; Shamoth from Harod; Helex from Pelet; Ira, son of Ikish from Tekoa; Abiezer from Anathoth; Sibekai from Osha; Eli from Hahor; Merai from Netophah; Heled, son of Baneh from Netophah; Ithai, son of Ribai from Gibeah in Benjamin; Benaiah from Pirathon; Uri from the valleys near Gash; Abiel from Arba; Azamaveth from Bahuram; Eliabah from Shalbon; Hasem from Gizon; Jonathan, son of Shagi from Ara; Ayam, son of Sakar from Hara; Eliphal, son of Ur; Ephah from Mekara; Ahijah from Pelon; Ezra from Carmel; Naira, son of Isbai; Joel, brother of Nathan; Mibhar, son of Agri; Zelek from Ammon; Narai, Joab's armor-bearer from Beeroth; Ira and Gareb from Jatir; Uriah the Hittite; Zabad, son of Hailai; Adina, son of Shiza, a leading member of the tribe of Reuben, with his own group of 30 soldiers; Hanan, son of Makar; Josaphat from Mithan; Uzziah from Ashterah; Shammah and Jeiel, son of Otham, from Aroer; Jediael and Johar, son of Shimri, from Tiz; Eliel from Hava; Jeribai and Joshaviah, son of Elnam; Ithma from Moab; Eliel, Obed, and Jashiel from Zobah. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Here's a quick recap of the 2.5 chapters we've read so far. First, in 1 Chronicles 9:35 to 44, we read about the ancestors and descendants of King Saul, and the names of his children were mentioned and their children's children. Then we read 1 Chronicles 10, where we read again of the death of King Saul, which matches the accounts given in 2 Samuel. But in this account, we were told why he died. That he died because he was unfaithful to the Lord and because he disobeyed the Lord's command. Then in chapter 11, we read about how David became king of Judah, but this account was quite detailed than what we read in 2 Samuel, in that the name of the valiant men that fought with David were mentioned. And in the latter part of the chapter, we were told about other outstanding soldiers, and that's the end of the summary. What stood out to you, my love, in chapter 9?
Just before I share what stood out to me, to just give because now we found ourselves in another new book, Chronicles. We were previously in Samuel, 2 Samuel, and sometimes we dab into the Psalms, but now we are in 1 Chronicles, and we didn't even start from chapter 1. We jumped straight into the mid of chapter 9. And the reason for that is because from 1 Chronicles, the entire book of Chronicles, of course, as the name signifies, is about trying to chronicle the history of the genealogies of the Israelites. This was written mainly after the exile. So as we go on in the story, we're going to see two major exiles. First, the exile of the northern kingdom, and eventually the exile of the southern kingdom, Judah. Exile in the sense that they were taken into captivity. So later on down the history of the Israelites, part of the judgment of God that came upon them when they turned away from God was that he allowed foreign nations to capture them again. Pretty much like, of course, when they went to Egypt, it was on the invitation of Joseph. It was a voluntary and even celebratory going into Egypt, but in Egypt they became slaves. But this time around, God is going to send different kingdoms, first the Assyrian, to take into captivity those in the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the Babylonians to take into captivity Judah, the kingdom of Judah, later on in history. But at some point, these people in exile began to return, again according to the promise of God, in fulfillment of God's promises to them. And as they were returning back to the Israelite territory, to the lands that their forefathers occupied, they also began to write to reclaim their history and to preserve it in a way that is both theological and also giving them a sense of national identity again. So that's the context in which Chronicles was written. So apparently the book of 2 Samuel would have been one of the primary sources for the chroniclers that were writing the book of Chronicles, the specific names of which we do not know. So, given that context, 1 Chronicles chapters 9, 10, and 11 that we have read, chapter 9 details the end of King Saul's life, as we have seen before, but also giving us a chronology up until that point and beyond. There are many names we see here that we didn't see or hear anything about in 2 Samuel. We just knew that Saul had 4 sons. But apparently those sons, some of them still had sons that then went on to have sons. Saul's dynasty, in a sense, still continued, even though none of them could possibly be king, because all the 4 sons were murdered on the same day in battle together with their father.
What stood out to me in chapter 9 was how that Saul's sons and his descendants were mentioned, in that despite Saul's unfaithfulness, he remained in the record, and his sons were in the record. They were not blotted out of memory or because of Saul's action, but despite his action, we were told whose Jonathan's sons were, and it goes on and on.
Part of the motive for writing the book of Chronicles again, is to preserve that sense of national identity. And that influences the way some of the narratives are told. It influences who is named. It influences whose names are omitted. It influences the details that they include. They try to avoid all the unnecessary tragic details because the purpose of the book was to give them a hopeful view of the future rather than dwelling on the judgments of the past. But how that leads on to the omission of a name like Mephibosheth, I don't know. But again, when we get to the story of when David calls for Mephibosheth, it was clear that even David did not know that there is anybody like that existed. It was just is there still any possible survivor in the family of Jonathan so that I can be kind to him as I promised Jonathan? And then someone said, actually, there is still one. So maybe because the nurse did carry him away at the age of 5, nobody really knew about his existence until much later. Who knows? So let's go to chapter 10. What stood out to you?
Verse 13 to 14, when we're told about why Saul died.
Mm-hmm.
And that it was because he was unfaithful and he consulted spirits of the dead instead of consulting God. Yeah.
Same for me. That commentary wasn't included in 2 Samuel, but again, it was spotlighted clearly here, even though in our own reflection we've observed and repeatedly emphasized that his cycle of repeated disobediences led him eventually to such a very gruesome end and a disappointing narrative to the end of his life. Having started so well, all by God's grace, and then it just kept going downhill. And then in chapter 11, what stood out to me is the accounts of the 3 and the 30. On the one hand, showing us that, there are levels to intimacy and exploits, in a manner of speaking. Jesus had 12 disciples, but even within the 12, there was a 3. And we are seeing such a structure being played out here as well, centuries before Jesus' incarnation in that sense. So David did have a famous 30, but apart from the famous 30, there was yet another group of 3 that were like his inner circle and were super famous because they accomplished super exploits in that sense. And yes, it's good to see the list of names, although counting those names of the other outstanding soldiers, they are much more than 30. So I don't think that's the list of the 30. In fact, there are over 40 names mentioned in that list from 26 to 47. But yeah, that's what stood out to me. How about you?
Same. But the famous soldier that stood out to me was Eleazar, son of Dodo. How that it was just in the barley field when the Israelites started to run away. And instead of him to run, he and his men took a stand in the middle of the field and fought the Philistines. That's even after the Philistines had victory over them. They chose not to run, but they stood valiantly and fought. And God gave them great victory. That's quite instructive.
Indeed. It's also interesting how these famous 3 soldiers decided to go and grant just a wishful thinking that David had, just a homesickness that made him desire waters from Bethlehem. And they went crossing enemy lines just to get water for their king. And again, just an immense level of loyalty that is beyond comprehension. Why would you risk your life just because your leader wants a drink of water? And then David's action in pouring away the water eventually and not drinking it also says something of his own leadership and his heart for God. Like he wouldn't just take things for granted, and he understands the immense sacrifice that has gone into that, and he thought, what best to do with this sacrifice? How best to honor it than to pay it forward and return it back to God? So yeah, just interesting narratives here and there.
Yes.
As we continue in the story, we will be seeing the accounts in 2 Samuel vis-a-vis the accounts in Chronicles. For the next few days, we are going to dwell more in the Chronicles version, as well as some Psalms that David wrote within this period. And before we return back to 2 Samuel, will not be until day 102. But join us again on day 95 as we continue the story. Still in 1 Chronicles, we'll be looking at chapters 12 to chapter 15. But still then, just remember,
you're not alone.
Today, God bless you.